Okay, so we are going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to talk, I'm going to kind of give you an overview of what we'll be talking about. We may have people come in throughout the webinar, which is fine, just so you know this is being recorded. And so that way you understand that if you do interact, you are being recorded, but also for later use. We will supply this recording on our YouTube, the Georgia Historical Society YouTube page, where you can come back and rewatch it, and we can share it. Also, you could share it with other educators, any of your teammates, or people with your school, or even for future professional development. Just a few housekeeping things before we get into it. We do have the chat open. So as we're going through this, if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we will take care of that. You are here for the Using the Georgia's Westward Expansion Student Inquiry Kit in the classroom teacher training webinar. This program is a part of the Georgia Historical Society's Georgia History Festival, which is a K-12 program that we do each year that starts in September with the new school year and culminates in February, which is the founding month of the Georgia colony. And I'll talk a little bit about the various things that we do depending on our time here today with the Georgia History Festival. This is just one of the many resources that we are presenting this year, and this is just one of several webinars that we have as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. And as I said, if you have any questions, just go ahead and put those in the chat. So just real quick, I am Lisa Landers, the Education Manager at the Georgia Historical Society. I have been with GHS for a little over 3 years, and prior to that, I was a classroom teacher, and I taught actually high school history for the most part, all the 9 through 12 various subjects for 8 years. So that is a little bit of my background. We also have with us today, kind of in the behind the scenes role, Sheila Boone, who is the Membership and Outreach Coordinator for the Georgia Historical Society. She will be making sure that we are good to go from the background. She'll be monitoring any of the chat and the any questions as well. And she will let me know if any questions come up. So if you have anything, she will be seeing that. And just if you have any issues going forward as we're kind of going through this, just let us know. So really quickly, I want to just give you a review of what is the Georgia Historical Society. If you're not familiar with us, we are a research and education institution that was founded in 1839 with the mission to collect, examine, and teach Georgia and American history. The research center that we have is located in Savannah, Georgia, which is where I am and coming from you today. And it houses an enormous collection of material, primary source material, and a rare book library, non-circulating library for research. The research center has been undergoing a renovation and expansion for the last 3 years, and we are excited to have that reopen here soon. So we are excited for that. And that's just a little bit about us. And just so you know that every classroom resource, program, event that we do for students and for teachers is really based on the collections that we have here at the Research Center and in the archives building. So it comes from our primary source material. We do pull materials from the Library of Congress and other organizations as well, but everything really is built on the collections that we have here at the Georgia Historical Society. So when you're using our material, you're using primary sources in your classroom that come from Georgia and that we house here. This is kind of our agenda of what we're going to go over today. It is pretty tight. I do want to get a lot of information in. An hour is not a long time, as you all know, but I think we can do it. And of course, we'll try to have some time for questions. So I'm going to give you a little background on the Georgia History Festival and what that is. And then I will also talk about the theme for this year. Each year, there's a unique theme. The inquiry kit that we're talking about today is really based on students using both not only primary sources to learn, but also historical markers. So I'm going to give a little background on what are historical markers, what is the historical marker program, and how that works. And then I'm going to give an overview of the Westward Expansion Student Inquiry Kit, which is several parts, and I'll talk about that. I'm going to review with you one of the strategies in the inquiry kit, which is a close reading of a historical marker. So we'll run through that as well. And then at the end of the program, we'll talk answer any questions you might have. I will also do my best to present you with our other GHF events, Georgia History Festival events that we have coming up, including other educator webinars, as well as events for students and classroom resources. Okay, so as I said, the Georgia History Festival is something that we do every year. And the Georgia History Festival is ultimately our biggest K-12 education program that we do. And it essentially lasts for, half of a year, because we start this in September, usually with the beginning of the new school year. And then it culminates in February, usually on what we call Georgia Day, or a day that represents Georgia Day, which is the founding of the Georgia colony. And so between September and February, throughout that time, we will release new classroom resources. We will do webinars for those classroom resources, and we have a couple of student-related events they can participate in as well. So we have a lot going on with the Georgia History Festival. It's something we do every year. So if you're new to us, we are so excited to have you with us. If you've been coming for this content and for Georgia History Festival, for years now or for more than 1 year, then it's great to have you back. So this year's theme is From Marshes to Mountains: Georgia's Changing Landscape, Geography, History, and Community. So this theme is really a little bit different in the sense that we're focusing more kind of on a theme, and that is geography, the idea of land. So this year we're exploring how land and our relationship to it have been crucial factors in creating our social, cultural, and economic and political systems over time here in Georgia. And specifically, our educational resources for this theme focuses on studying geography, which provides us a unique perspective for understanding how land has been connected to citizenship and civic participation throughout Georgia's history. We will examine in these classroom resources, like the inquiry kit, we examine the forces that determine land use, land ownership, why people move from place to place, and what it means to create a community. We are also, specifically within our K-12 educational programs, we are focusing on the Westward Expansion time period in Georgia, that 1789 to 1840 time period, where we're really looking at the various diverse populations in the state at that time, including not only those that we think of as moving west, white settlers or Georgia settlers, but also Native Americans, as well as enslaved Africans and even emancipated Black individuals. And then looking at how their relationships over time with the land changes over time, and often can be even contentious. So that is the major theme that we're working with this year for the Georgia History Festival. So everything that we do is going to fall really within that theme. So as I said, I was going to give you a little bit of background on the Georgia Historical Marker Program, because again, this theme really lends itself to what we kind of think of as place-based history. And that's really what the marker program is about. Historical markers in the state of Georgia, the historical marker program dates back to the 1950s. And so this is something that is really extensive. And you can find them all over the state. So a roadside historical marker, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, you see the image of one here on the top of this slide. But roadside historical markers can be found across the state. They share the stories of our past in a very identifiable and understandable format. GHS has administered this program since 1998, and during that time, over the last 20 years or so, GHS has erected over 300 new markers on a wide variety of subjects and across the state of Georgia, so throughout counties in Georgia, and economic topics, political topics, social, cultural, historical topics as well, so a wide variety of subjects. Now, prior to 1998, the marker program was administered by the Department of Natural Resources for many years. And even before that, when it was first established, it was administered by the Georgia Historical Commission, which was established by the Georgia General Assembly in 1951. The state actively erected markers between the 1950s and the 1990s. And approximately 2,000 markers were installed across the state. So that just gives you an idea that we have really over 2,000 markers in the Georgia Historical Marker Program across Georgia. So that is, an enormous amount, meaning that no matter where you are in Georgia, there is most likely a historical marker in your community or in your county or somewhere nearby. So that is one of the many reasons why I think this is such a valuable resource for classrooms. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. The marker program was really established in preparation for the centennial of the Civil War. And so in the 1950s, looking at that centennial time period, and is one of the busiest time periods. Some of the oldest markers in this program have to do with the Civil War, have to do specifically with things like troop movements and battles. A lot of them are in the Atlanta area simply because of the location of the Civil War, the kind of the concentration there. And so when I say we erect markers on a wider variety of subjects now, it's not just military history, it is other topics as well, although you will see a lot of military history in the marker program. And just so you understand how we erect new markers, this is a process to obtain a new historical marker. It is a competitive process. Organizations, individuals, businesses, they have to apply using a historical marker application, and that involves an enormous amount of historical research and just a lot of various steps. And then applications are then looked at and will be decided on by a committee, not the Georgia Historical Society. So we do have a committee that decides which historical markers will get erected based on the applications that are submitted. And if you have any questions about that, I will be happy to take those at the end of the program, because it is an interesting process. And I do highly suggest creating a historical marker is a great activity for your classroom. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well today. So why use historical markers in your classroom? This is just a handful of reasons. I think there are many more, but I just wanted to give you a rundown to think how you can use this creatively in your classroom. So first of all, markers that are erected today, especially by the Georgia Historical Society, they are local events that are connected to and help illustrate wider themes in Georgia and American history. So we have these local events that are marked by historical markers that are connected to the state and the national story. So one of the keys to engaging with history, especially for young people, but really anybody, is to make that history relatable. And one of the ways that we can do this is look at the stories from our own communities that help it illustrate the state and national stories. So, you can take a marker about the civil rights movement in Albany or in Atlanta and look at it to kind of consider what was the civil rights movement like there, but also connect it to the larger movement for the state or the nation. As I said, historical markers in the state have been erected for over 70 years. So that means that we have a variety of authors who have written these markers. And so you will see how, if you look at older markers compared to newer markers, how that has changed over time. And they also help to highlight the significant changes in Georgia over time, the cultural, the economic, the political landscape, and how that changes over time. This resource is ever growing. We add new markers every year, approximately, I'm kind of guessing here, but I would say between 20 and 25 on average a year. We have new markers, and those represent all types of different topics. It's extremely a valuable resource because it is located in all of our communities all over the state and freely available. You can access them in person, on site. You can go to these places, and we have a database and a website that will help you do that, the Georgia Historical Marker Database, but you can also access any of these markers online through that database. So even if you're not in that area, but you want to look at historical markers in an area across the state, you can, or students can, and that is all free and available to be able to be used in a classroom. Historical markers obviously are text-based material, so helping to promote the idea of literacy in your social studies classroom, where you can examine things like historiography and how historical writing has changed over time, look at historical interpretation. You could even assess bias here. So really focusing on some literacy strategies while engaging students in the local, state, and national histories. And then ultimately, the whole point of all of this is to combine historical markers and primary sources. How can we take a historical marker and make it more dynamic than it is? And for the classroom, that's really bringing in primary source analysis. And so if a historical marker is a window into a story, primary sources are the details that help to fill out that story. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But using historical markers, primary sources, and historical inquiry help promote things like problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, and historical literacy. Okay, so as I said, you may have seen, a historical marker in your neighborhood, in your community, in your county, while you're driving, on vacation, taking a road trip, whatever. And a lot of historical markers were established for the idea of tourism and heritage tourism. So it makes sense that you see them on the side of the road. I wanted to give you an idea that if you see them out in the wild per se, in real life, I just wanted to help you understand how to know what is an older historical marker and what is a newer marker. As I said, that GHS started managing or administering this program in 1998. So prior to 1998, the marker here that's on the left that refers to Reynolds Brigade at the Ravine, that is an older version of a marker. They are usually this kind of green tint with gold writing, but the telltale sign really is the seal at the top. You see that it says it is the seal of the state of Georgia. So that up there is going to let you know that this marker was erected either by the Georgia Historical Commission or the Department of Natural Resources prior to 1998, and that the Georgia Historical Society did not erect this marker. Markers erected by GHS over the last 20 years look like the one on the right, which is black with silver writing. And again, the telltale sign really being the seal at the top. The seal here is the Georgia Historical Society seal, which is a non-sibi sed elise seal, which is not for self, but for others, the motto of the Georgia trustees. So just so you know, and so if you're ever using markers in your classroom or just have questions, now you have an idea of how to tell where these come from. I also want to make a note that not all historical markers in the state of Georgia fall under this program. There are organizations throughout the state, individuals, maybe even businesses that can and do erect historical markers on their own without the help of the Georgia Historical Society or support. So just be mindful of that as well. So your own community may have its own marker program. Okay, so as we know, nothing is quite perfect, especially when we're thinking about using it in the classroom, especially when it comes to using primary sources, historical writing, all that kind of thing. So let's talk about a few pitfalls that may come when using historical markers in the classroom. First of all, as we said, it's a limited text. Most historical markers are around 130 words or less. So I always like to say it's a window into the story. It is not the full story. You're not going to be able to get every single detail from 130 words, which is challenging for many reasons. So you may want to think and consider, or have your students consider, well, what is missing from this text, especially some of these older markers. Now, as we know, historiography, or the way that we write about history, changes over time. We know that even the way that we teach about history changes over time. I'm sure many of you have been going through that and considering that over the last few years in your classroom, how to best teach history. And so all of that it changes as we move forward, including the language that we might use. So just be mindful that in older historical markers, you may see language that is celebratory, or you may see language that we don't typically use today, and that we might even find to be inappropriate in some ways. So just be mindful of that, especially in your older markers. Not as much, in the markers that we have erected over the last 20 years, but in those markers from the 50s and 60s specifically. Although these are secondary sources and many of them our markers do have historical claims, some of them do not have a thesis statement, do not have a main claim, and especially when we're looking at the markers from the older time periods. So just keep that in mind, but I think that's a great opportunity for learning. If you find a marker that doesn't really have a thesis statement or historical claim, how can students rewrite that marker to create such a thing? There are a lot of different ways you could explore that. Historical markers are created as secondary sources. They are usually written by someone who, or people who were not there at that time period, and usually somewhere between 25, 30 or more years later. So they are secondary sources. But because the marker program in Georgia is so established over time, you could technically use some of these as primary sources, specifically the markers that were written early on, 50s, 60s, 70s. Those markers could potentially serve as primary sources for that time period and what was going on in Georgia at that time. So they are secondary sources, but sometimes they can be primary sources. Obviously, changes happen in our culture, in our society, the things that we value, the things that we think that are deemed important. And so just be mindful of that obviously markers are going to evolve with all those changes over time. And then not all of our markers are photographed. So we have a historical marker database, and Sheila, I think you have already maybe shared this link, and I forgot to ask you to share the previous one, but we'll come back to that. Sheila is going to share a link in the chat that will take you to the historical marker database, so you'll know where it is. When you get there, this is the type of page you will see. You can see that for this particular marker, the photograph, you cannot read that marker. It is too far away for whatever reason, I'm not sure. But on every marker page, the text is there, all the information you need is there, its location. There's actually a map also on this page, it's just not seen here. And so just know that if you can't find the picture of a historical marker, you can come to the historical marker database to find all the pertinent details for the marker itself. Okay, so I'm going to take a brief pause right here, and just because we're about to shift and talk about the inquiry itself, but are there any questions regarding anything that I've talked about for the historical marker program? And then feel free to mute or unmute yourself as needed if you'd like to, or you can just put a question in the chat. Okay, looks like for now we don't have any questions, which is great. If you do think of one, feel free to put it in the chat as we go along, or just shout it out as well. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears. We've talked a little bit. Now you have an idea of what the marker program is and what it's about and its history. Like I said, this inquiry is really focused, the Georgia's Westward Expansion Student Inquiry Kit is focused on using not only primary sources where students will explore primary sources, but also roadside historical markers, again, because it's such a place-based theme. The standard that this inquiry kit is aligned to is for Georgia Studies, 8th grade Georgia Studies, and it is the Westward Expansion standard. So there are a lot of parts to this standard, which this inquiry kit pretty much covers every part, maybe not every single detail, but it gets after a lot of the various parts of this standard. And so we'll see those as we look at the overview. Okay, so this is, again, historical inquiry. I want to talk a little bit about what is historical inquiry and why that matters and why we use it. First of all, historical inquiry, anything that GHS creates for the classroom is often going to be inquiry-based, which just essentially means leading with a question or leading with questions that the students have. And that may include strategies or activities where students generate their own questions. We use the inquiry design model from C3 teachers to write these historical inquiries. If you're not familiar with that, it is essentially a type of unit plan. This whole inquiry kit is a kit because it comes with several parts, and it is a unit plan. It is not something that you could do in one day. And so just to wrap your mind around that, there is a lot of information, and the inquiry design model is meant to do that. If you're interested in historical inquiry, but you're not sure you want to tackle something as detailed as this particular inquiry kit, please feel free to contact me. I would be happy to talk to you about how to kind of wade into using historical inquiry classroom or even primary source analysis. If it's not something you've done before, please let me know, shoot me an email, give me a phone call. I'll be happy to help you with any ways of getting started. I always say it's easier to start, slow, start simple, and then build from there. Okay, so as I said, we base everything on the C3 teachers inquiry design model. So here are the various parts of the inquiry design model. As I'm going over this, I will just remind you that on that Georgia History Festival page, which I think Sheila shared in the chat, there is a downloadable teacher guide that will explain everything that I am talking about right now. So if you get confused or if you need to come back later, the teacher guide is, you can download it, it's a PDF, and it will talk about all this, pretty much anything I'm about to talk about. We also have student instruction pages that are available for download as well for students to use in the classroom that you can both print out or use online. Okay, so parts of a C3 inquiry start with a compelling question. Compelling questions are meant to engage students in critical thinking. They're meant to get students thinking creatively about a topic, and they're meant to really be broad, open-ended, broad, and kind of cut across various social studies themes. The first activity in a C3 inquiry is the staging the question activity, which essentially just sets up the question for the students. So it's an activity that helps them to understand what they're about to start learning. The meat of a C3 inquiry is the supporting questions and formative performance tasks that are included. And this is really where your students are going to be doing the most of the work. Most C3 inquiries have 3 supporting questions and formative performance tasks, which is just an activity, fancy word for activity. This one has 4 because this standard does cover a lot of territory. And I will show you what those 4 things are in just a moment. This is where the students are really going to practice those primary source analysis skills, the critical thinking, the problem solving, all of that. Ultimately, the whole point of a C3 inquiry is to build up to the summative assessment, which is where students will build an argument to respond to the compelling question. So essentially just to be able to respond to whatever the question is that this inquiry is about. I always encourage teachers to remember that arguments don't have to just be written. Certainly they could write an essay in response to that question. It could be, a 5-part traditional essay, but it could also be something creative. I would encourage you to think about doing oral presentations or even project-based assessments as well. And the final part of a C3 inquiry is the taking informed action. And this part is where students get to apply the skills they've been practicing and apply it to a real world situation. So something that is going on now or that is relative to them today. Okay, so those are the parts. Now I'm going to give you the detailed information about each part for this particular student inquiry. So starting with the compelling question. The question for this inquiry is, how did Georgia change during its period of westward expansion from 1789 to 1840? That is pulled straight from the standard. So essentially, it's just the standard in the form of a question. It's extremely broad. Obviously, there are many answers to this question. Again, it's meant to be that way. The first activity is the staging the question activity. So this is setting up the question for students. This activity in this inquiry is understanding historical markers. And we're actually going to practice. I'm going to show you this activity in just a moment so you can get an idea. What I really like about this is that it not only helps to set up the question for students and what they're going to be learning about in regard to westward expansion, but it also helps students understand the parts of a historical marker because they're going to see markers throughout this inquiry. So if you continue and you go on and do the other parts of the inquiry, every part is going to be related to historical markers. So we want to make sure students understand what they are, what is the makeup of them, and so they can recognize it and understand what to do when they come across one. The next 4 parts that I'm going to talk about, starting with the Yazoo land fraud, here is the 4 supporting questions and formative performance tasks. This is the meat. Each one of these is meant to be a part of this unit, building on this idea of trying to answer the compelling question. But I will say that you could also very easily pull each one of these out as its own lesson. So if you didn't have time or don't have time or doesn't make sense for you to do this entire student inquiry with your class, you could come and just pull the material for each one of these individual activities and focus on the topic that it is about. So the first one is about the Yazoo land fraud. And it is where students will explore the Yazoo land fraud historical marker, look at a set of primary sources to understand how that event impacted Georgia. And you can see there is the supporting question. It's also important to note that each one of these supporting questions and tasks has its own assessment. So there's assessment built in. It is essentially to respond to whatever the supporting question is, but you will see those you can see that all in the teacher guide. The second supporting question and task is about the 5 capitals in Georgia, where students will look at historic maps in correlation to historical markers and details in historical markers to try to understand why the capitals have moved how the capitals and why the capitals moved during the Westward Expansion time period to 5 different geographic locations across the state. So not only just looking at what those locations are, but why those particular locations. Is it because of transportation? Is it because of trade? What were the reasons why they were moved to this particular location? The third supporting question and formative performance task is Georgia moves west, the push and pull factor. So here we're looking at how populations, various groups of people and populations in Georgia migrate during this westward expansion time period. So we're not just looking at the movement of Georgia settlers, but also movement of Native Americans, as well as the movement of enslaved Africans or enslaved people in general. And thinking about what are the various political and economic factors that encourage that, the push and the pull. So looking at things like transportation, like the railroad, but also looking at things like the expansion of the cotton industry and the desire for more fertile land and the invention of the cotton gin and how that helps to expand the cotton industry and how really that fuels the movement west. The final supporting question and task is involves the experiences of the Creek and the Cherokee. This activity involves looking at 3 separate historic maps and looking from this time period and looking how those maps change in chronological order. So essentially what you see is how the counties in the state of Georgia are growing over time. And as you look at each map, those counties move further west and further west, all while the Native American territory of the Creek and the Cherokee diminishes. And so it starts to set up this idea of what's happening for the Creek and the Cherokee. Students then have an opportunity to actually go into our marker database online and use what we call the Plan Your Route feature, where you can actually create your own road trip, or I like to call it a historical marker trail. And so we'll have students challenge them to find historical markers that illustrate the experiences of the Creek and Cherokee during westward expansion, and there are many out there that talk about this subject, and create their own little road trip. They also, going along with this activity, will find primary sources that relate to those markers in their route that they've created. I think it's important to consider here that it says experiences of Creek and Cherokee, but every source that students look at in this particular activity is going to be created by someone that is most likely not a member of the Creek or the Cherokee. So whether it's a historical marker or information from the Georgia Historical Society, we are not the Creek and the Cherokee. So want to keep that in mind, that these, especially historical markers, were not written from the perspective of the Creek or the Cherokee. So that's why we kind of layer in this idea of going and finding primary sources that relate to the markers. And I would highly encourage that when students are doing this activity, they're looking for primary or potentially even secondary sources that are written from the perspective of the Creek and the Cherokee specifically. And that way you can start to see a more balanced perspective on history. It's not just what the Georgia Historical Society is putting out there, what past organizations have put out there, but it is also looking at those experiences from the Creek and the Cherokee. Okay, so the summative assessment, as I said earlier, is just the argument to respond to the compelling question. And then finally, the taking informed action. And this is where students have an opportunity to create their own historical marker. I love this activity for the classroom. It involves historical research. It engages them in either creating a new historical marker or rewriting a historical marker based on what they've learned, based on the primary sources they've already pulled or analyzed, and they can write a marker based on current scholarship, especially compared to older markers, but based on current scholarship about Westward Expansion and even Native American history. So those are the various parts. So when you look at the teacher guide or you look on the GHS the Georgia History Festival website that Sheila shared with you earlier, everything that you can download is representative of all these various parts. And as I said, the teacher guide will talk to you about everything that I just explained. So if you have questions or need a reminder. For now, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to focus on this staging the question activity. So this is the very first activity in the inquiry kit. It is a close reading of a historical marker. So if you've ever done a close reading with students or used that activity or strategy in your classroom, this will seem very similar to you or familiar to you. And ultimately, like I said before, this activity helps to orient students not only to what a historical marker is and how it's made, or what the makeup of it is, but it also helps them to introduces the idea of the standard. What is Westward Expansion? We're going to focus on this Fort Wilkinson marker that you see on the right. And although, like I said before, this is not going to give students the full story of Westward Expansion, it's going to start to give them a little peek into the window. Sheila has just shared with us in the chat, I believe, the link to the historical marker page for this marker. So if you want to pull that up so you can see what that looks like, you're welcome to. That is available to you. Before doing any activity with a historical marker, I think it's very important to make sure your students understand these various characteristics. So first, that the text is usually 130 words or less. Second is that a historical marker marks a specific geographic location. That's the whole point of the marker program. It's about marking a specific location in Georgia. Of course, they tell the stories of not only events, but also places and people that have helped shape Georgia's history. And they are usually, most likely, written as a secondary source. Now, there are some markers out there that we have erected, for example, with the Civil Rights Movement or the Civil Rights Trail, where maybe people that experienced the event it's marking were also involved because that's a more recent history. But for the most part, these are usually written by someone who is not there, who did not have experience of the event firsthand. And certainly our staff here at GHS who helped to craft this historical marker text were most likely not at that event, even though they may be working with people who may have been. Okay, so Fort Wilkinson marker is the one we're going to look at. Here are the 4 steps. We're going to take each one of them one by one. I am going to ask maybe for a little bit of your feedback or just participation, nothing crazy, but we are going to kind of move quickly because I just want to make sure we have plenty of time for everything. Okay, so again, this is the setting the stage or the staging the question activity. And so we're thinking about setting up that compelling question about how Georgia has changed during the Westward Expansion. The first reading, and I would say anytime you are doing historical inquiry in your classroom, whether it's a primary source or something like this, a historical marker, the first thing that we want to train our students to do is to look for source information. So first reading, source information. So this is going to involve not even reading the text of the marker. This is only going to involve looking for the source information. Source information can include or should include the title of the marker, the date it was created, not the date of the event, the date the marker was created, its location, so what is its geographic location that it's marking, and then the creator or creators, depending on when this marker was erected and by who. It may have more than one creator. The Georgia Historical Society today partners with other organizations to create these, so it's not just us. All right, so let's start by just practicing this a little bit. So obviously, let's start with the title. I think that's an obvious one, so I'm going to point that out for us. It's the Fort Wilkinson historical marker. So that is the title. So immediately we know what we're talking about. Can anyone locate the time period in which this historical marker was erected? And you're welcome to shout it out if you can see it, find it, or you can put it in the chat. Can anyone locate the year that it was erected? All right, yes, Jennifer, you see 1961, very good. That is correct. So you can see down here in the bottom right-hand corner, all markers will have this. In the bottom right-hand corner is going to be a year. And so here we see, I know it's kind of hard to see here, but 1961. Can anybody tell the location of this marker? This is a little bit more challenging. Okay, so again, this does not involve reading the text because you can figure out the location, one, by where it's located, but we can't tell that in this photo. So the location of a historical marker, like the date it was created, is on the opposite side, so the bottom left-hand corner. Now, we see here, this is a set of numbers. It says 005-23, I believe. 005 being the county code that it's in. So there are many counties in the state of Georgia. I highly doubt, any of our students or us in general will know every single county code off the top of our heads. So I'm going to show you how you can figure out a location of the marker without having to know the county code in just one moment. Nice job. Yes, it is Baldwin County. Very good. That is correct. All right. So, and now you see the -23. So what does that mean? When we see like a .23 or another number, that just means that this is the 23rd marker established in this county. Okay, so if we had one for the date, if it said, for example, 2012.5, that would be the 5th historical marker erected in the year 2012. Okay, so that's our date, our location, and then finally we have our creator, which you can see right here at the very bottom is the Georgia Historical Commission. So hopefully you already kind of knew that because we talked about the difference between the older and the newer markers at the beginning, where this one is clearly an older marker because it has the state seal at the top. Okay, so now we have a little bit of information, which is our source information. We haven't even read the marker yet, but we know that this is located in Baldwin County, and we know is created by the Historical Commission in 1961, and our topic is Fort Wilkinson. You can also come to the marker database, which is the page that Sheila shared with you, to find this information. So again, on every marker page, it's going to show you in an interactive map. You can see you can zoom in and out here and see exactly where this marker is located. So it's very close to Milledgeville. And so still though, you may not exactly know where that is, or students may not know where that is. So you can come down here, there's the county. It is Baldwin County. There's our title. Here, the marker program is who created it. For newer markers, you will see this actually written at the bottom of the page to be very clear. It'll say erected by, but you'll see it on this page. And then we have our year erected. So this is what the marker pages look like if you don't want to use a photo or if you don't have an image of a marker. Okay, so now we're on reading number 2. For this reading is really, the whole point of this reading is to help to build on the students' content knowledge. Here again, we're really not reading the full marker text. You could really even skim the marker text for this reading. And so they're looking for, and you can have them highlight, you can have them circle, you can have them list. You could put this on a smart board and send students up to the board. You could print it out. There are various ways. They can do it on the computer that they could do this, but want to look for key terms. So that might be vocabulary that you are learning about in class, names in events, places like proper nouns, and dates. So that's what we're going to look for here, key terms and dates. So if we start out and we're just kind of glancing, we see a date right off the bat, 1797. We keep going, we start to see some proper nouns. We see Creek Indians, and I'm just pointing out a few. There are definitely others. We see the Treaty of New York, 1790. We see Commissioner's Creek, and we see the Ocmulgee River. Ocmulgee River, I always have a hard time with that. And so those are, so we start to get a picture of what this is about without even really reading the full text. Now, there are also other terms here, like trading house, not a proper noun, but maybe a vocabulary word. Maybe not trading house in particular, but trade, I'm sure is. We have land lottery. We know that is a big part of this standard. And we have session. These are all terms, specifically land lottery and land sessions, that are going to be important for students to understand before they can understand really any of the content for this standard. So this is an opportunity to have students look up these words. Maybe they already know them. Maybe they can pull on their prior knowledge. You could have them pair up with a group or a partner, and they can compare their list. And so you can kind of decide what you want them to do from here. But ultimately, it's an opportunity to start building that content knowledge. What are these things? Have we heard about them before? And how do they relate to what we're learning about? I always say it's a very good idea to reflect after each reading. You may want to say, okay, now that we've looked at these key terms and dates, what is that? How can we, what else can we learn based on the source information that we did in reading one? Reading one, we learned that this marker was erected in 1961, but Fort Wilkinson was established in 1797. This is a great learning opportunity for students. Well, what does that tell us? Well, this is a secondary source. This was written much longer after the fact, and so on, and many other learning opportunities there. For reading number 3, we're going to look for things we don't understand. So misunderstandings, words, phrases, ideas. One of the challenges that I have noticed for any student learning about history at any time is if they don't know the vocabulary, if they don't understand the words they're reading, they will not understand the questions they're being asked. They will not understand the primary sources that they're reading or looking at. So it's very important to not skip this step. So we may be looking for things that they need clarification on, words that they don't recognize or understand. Here I've circled 2, we've got garrison, we've got stockade. Again, these are things that could be even vocabulary terms that they need to understand. Here is a phrase, we've got extinguished Indian titles. Well, they may know the word extinguished, but what are Indian titles and how do those things go together? Again, we may have a little bit of overlap from the previous reading. Maybe they pointed to land lottery, pulled that term out, but they don't know what it is. Now is an excellent time for them to clarify that. What is a land lottery? Same with sessions, among other things here. So helping to clarify what these terms are going to help clarify the whole point of the marker, which is going to help clarify anything that they are learning. So it's very important that they know the words that they're reading. The final reading is what we call, I like to say reading like a historian, but you could say reading for understanding. Now they're going to actually do a full reading of the marker. It should be easier for them at this point because they've already kind of reviewed the marker multiple times. They've clarified anything they don't quite understand. So now when they read it, it's going to make more sense. For this reading, what we want to do is have them point out what is the main point of the marker? What is it telling us? We want to be able to pull out any historical claims or arguments. As I said, sometimes historical markers don't always have them. This one doesn't exactly have one, but it kind of does a little bit. But regardless, we can still look at what is the marker claiming or saying about the topic, what evidence is there that supports that, what other details jump out at us that help us to understand the title or the topic of this marker. So to begin with, we have the first line. 300 yards east of this point, Fort Wilkinson was established in 1797 on Georgia's Indian boundary. Some students may underline this as the main point. Okay. Some students may go on and read and underline something like this. It was an early trading house where Creek Indians were provided agricultural supplies under the Treaty of New York. Also an important point being made about Fort Wilkinson. Students may disagree here. Again, these are learning opportunities to discuss with students what is a historical claim. In order to make a claim, you have to have evidence and so on. Students may even go on to point out other details about Fort Wilkinson in this step. There was a treaty signed there which extinguished Indian titles to land westward of Commissioner's Creek. The first Georgia land lottery took place here, and it was actually moved following the expansion of the perimeter of Indian land cessions. So we can start to get an idea of what's happening for Westward expansion. You can have students discuss the claims that they've pulled out. What did they think is the most important pieces of evidence? What are the most important points about Fort Wilkinson, and so on. Okay, so once we've done our close reading, it's really not enough. Again, I said that this is a window into the topic itself. It's really not enough to stop there. We do need to do some extra research. So we want to think about, how do we know if this information is reliable? Where did the person who wrote this, or people who wrote this, where did they get that information? And you know, what do historians do exactly when they're writing this? And the answer for all of these questions is research, primary and secondary source research. So this is a great time to introduce to students what is a primary source and what is a secondary source. We have given you an example of a primary source and a secondary source that relates to this marker for them to kind of move past the initial window of information and start to think further about these details. I highly suggest using the primary source analysis tool for any primary source analysis, especially if you've not done this before, but even if you have, it's a great resource. It's very easy to use. And it's from the Library of Congress. The primary source that is included with this activity is this land grant with a map of the plot of Baldwin County. And here they can go to, this is from the Digital Library of Georgia, but they can go here, they can zoom in if they're on their computer, and they can look at the various details and start to connect those details back to the Fort Wilkinson historical marker information. The secondary source we have here actually talks about Fort Wilkinson, the Treaty of Fort Wilkinson. It gives a little bit of other context for relationships with Native Americans and so on. And so this is giving our students a glimpse into historical research, explaining to them what is a primary source, what is a secondary source, and kind of moving past the marker itself and into the bigger picture. So takeaways from this early strategy, the very first strategy should be that students will understand that there was trade going on between Georgia settlers and Native Americans like the Creek Indians. Land was being exchanged specifically based on various treaties that ultimately result in Native Americans ceding land to Georgia, the state of Georgia specifically, or the federal government. White settlers are moving then into those ceded territories. The later activities, we'll talk about why that's happening. And then as white settlers are moving into those territories, Native Americans are moving out. And then we also want to think about who else is moving around at that time period as this is happening. There are questions I've included here to think about before moving on to the next activity. They just kind of preempt the upcoming activities. I'm going to move past those at the moment because I want to make sure that I give any chance for questions, and I know we're getting close to our time. So if you really like this idea of historical markers in the classroom, and you want to know more, we have a great blog. I think Sheila just shared it in the chat that talks about all different ways that you can do this. So if you want to try to think more creatively and think about that, go check out that blog. Everything that's highlighted on this list, creating your own historical marker, going beyond the text, and the online database, all those are included in this inquiry kit. So those activities are in one way or another, strategies are included. There are many, we have several marker scavenger hunts, which is a great activity for students to do. We have hidden history projects, which is essentially doing an art project in relationship to a historical marker and essentially what's not in the marker, which is a great activity. And then markers make very good jumping off points for research and research projects. So if you are doing a National History Day or some kind of research project or paper, it's a great place to start for a Georgia history topic. So I'm going to stop right there. Are there any questions that I can answer about using this classroom, how to access the materials, or anything else that we've talked about? And feel free to put it in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself if you'd like. As you may be thinking about questions, or if you're typing a question, I'm just going to give you a little preview of what we have coming up from the Georgia Historical Society. Like I said, if you are really interested in learning more about how to use historical markers in the classroom, I would highly suggest considering taking, if you want to dive deeper into this and how to do this, we have a free 10-week course coming up starting in January. that is teaching the civil rights movement with the Georgia Historical Marker Program, where myself and my colleague Elise Butler, who is the marker manager here at JHS, will be, and this is supported by Teaching with Primary Sources in the Library of Congress, where we will be doing an in-depth dive in how to use historical markers specifically for learning about the civil rights movement in Georgia. And so if this is something you're interested in, if you want to learn more about this, this is something I have been wanting to do for a long time with JHS. Please check it out. Registration is currently open. You can find it on our webpage. You can, we will also, I'm going to send all of our participants that are registered for this program a follow-up document with every link that we've talked about. I'll include this link as well. And so, or you can go to our georgiahistory.com website and go to the For Educators page and find Teaching with Primary Sources, and that is going to be available there. We do have some upcoming events for Georgia History Festival. As I said, this is just one of several webinars we have upcoming. We have a webinar coming up that we're going to be doing in partnership with the Coastal Georgia Historical Society, which is located in Glenn County. And it's titled Hometown Stories on the National Stage, Using Local Resources to Teach U.S. History. This is a great opportunity for you to learn how our historical organizations develop educational programs and how what we're doing to support K-12 education. The registration for that is now open, and that takes place on November 9th from the same time, 3 to 4 p.m. We also have two really fun events for students to participate in for Georgia Day this year. Like I said, Georgia Day takes place in February. It's technically February 12th. We are going to celebrate it or really commemorate it this year on February 11th because it's a Friday. But we have the Georgia Day Parade and Classroom Banner Competition. For anyone that is local to Savannah will know that that is something we do every year, have been doing for many years. And so if you're here in Savannah, you can register for that. If your school is doing field trips, if you want to participate in the banner competition. But we also have, for anyone across the state that wants to participate in Georgia Day, but can't be here for the parade, we're doing our statewide art contest again this year. And so we have webinars for both of those events. The webinar for the statewide art contest is on December 7th. From 3 to 4 p.m. Registration will open in November. And the Georgia Day Parade Classroom Banner Competition, if you're interested in participating in that, we have a webinar on January 6th. Well, that should be 22. I don't know why I said put there 21, but it's 22. Okay, other things, we do have classroom resources. We have the theme for this year's Georgia Day is Georgia's People and Places, playing off of our ultimate GHF theme. That we have a teacher guide that we have put together that will be available next week on our website. We have a resource for studying history through art, a kind of visual literacy guide that we will also be sharing with you on our website next week. And then we will also be doing a newspapers and education resource about analyzing maps and using spatial thinking skills, which will be available in January. If you want to be able to get all of these things, find these things, sign up for the Educators newsletter that you can sign up for on our website, georgiahistory.com, or you can just let me know and I will sign you up as well. So, okay, I think I've run up right up to the time. I saw that we had a couple people saying thank you. You are absolutely welcome. Thank you for attending. Are there any questions I can answer before we let you go? As I said, if you have any questions moving forward about this, please feel free to contact me. I'm going to put my email address back up. You are welcome, Jennifer. Thank you so much for attending today. I'm going to try to pull my email address back up, but of course I am now frozen. llanders@georgiahistory.com. And if you email me or call me, you will get me. So you will be able to get access to me. I'll be happy to talk to you about anything I can to support you in your classroom, any GHS resource. Yep, there is my email in the chat. Thank you, Sheila. And thank you everybody for joining us today. If you have any questions, just let us know.